sea nomads and Western Austronesian. Despite weather issues, connection, internet issues, military coup, we finally managed to have Professor Clifford Sather with us, which we're very glad to hear today. So, Professor Clifford, you can start. I will share your presentation right now.
Okay, you put it.
Here it is. And if you all can see the presentation, we are good to go.
All right, I want to talk about the easternmost of all the Southeast Asian nomads, and say something to begin with, just some rough facts about demography and geography. Compared to the people we've been talking about in the West, the Bajau Sama number of something on the order of 1,700,000, or sorry, 1,077,000 people. We didn't know this until fairly recently. I have quite good demographic data going back to the beginning of the 20th century for the Philippines and Sabah, Malaysian Sabah, but it wasn't until 2010 that we began to have accurate census data for Indonesia. Of this 1,077,000, over half of 571,000 Sama Bajau live in the Philippines, from the central islands of the Philippines, but mostly from Mindanao. I think there's a map here, but it's over, Bajau are dispersed over an immense area of Southeast Asia. At one point when I wrote my book, I estimated from recorded locations that we know where Bajau Sama speaking peoples live, that they were distributed over an area of about 2.25 million square kilometers. So it's an immense area. They're one of the most widely distributed people in Southeast Asia. In Sabah, I think if I can show it here. So as I don't know if I mentioned, but there's about 347,000 Bajau living in Sabah along both the eastern and both are here. The Western, sorry, my technical skills, even my mechanical skills are not so hot. Along the eastern coast of Sabah. So all of these 357,000 people, Bajau Sama speaking peoples in Sabah, live only here, and there are really no other Sama Bajau populations in any other part of Malaysia. So there's quite a large area separating, even though you have, as we've seen here, the Orang Suku Laut in Johor, in the Riau archipelago, and even in some in the Singapore. There's a wide distribution, they're widely separated from the Bajau Sama speaking peoples. So where I did my field work is at the tip, and where that photo you saw of the pile house village built over the sea is located in not above Tawau here on this coast. And that is the end of this Sulu archipelago that runs from this part of this western part of Mindanao right down. It's a tectonic arc of archipelago of volcanic islands that separate two extremely deep seas, the Sulu Sea and the Celebes Sea. so it's an area of incredible marine biodiversity. This is what makes, and recently in the Semporna district, there's also, as was talked about earlier in the session, a national park, a marine national park, newly established one. So this is a continuous island chain, and most of the population, the Philippine population of Bajo Sama speakers, live also along this island chain. So where I worked was a kind of the end point, the terminus on the east coast of Borneo. They're also today. They're also in central Philippines. They're Bajo Sama speaking. Even in Manila, metropolitan Manila, there's with motorized boats. There's been they're also here on Palawan Island. They're Bajo Sama speakers. With motorized boats, the Bajo become a kind of super nomads, and they're urban poor. In a lot of Philippine cities are made up of Bajo Sama migrants from the southern Philippines, and also a lot have moved to Sabah. And if you go to Kinabalu, the capital, you'll see former sea nomadic peoples on the streets. The other places are that you find in Indonesia. Then you find lots of Bajo living. Most of this population of the population of Bajo Sama speakers in Indonesia is about 159,000. So it's considerably smaller, but it's incredibly widely dispersed. So you've got mostly, this is an area fairly heavily settled, this northern part of Sulawesi. A lot of Bajo then in the southern and in this area of Sulawesi, and then from there out all through these in very small numbers through these islands of eastern Indonesia, going quite close to the Timor and quite close then to the border with the Australia, the northern coast of Australia, Queensland. There's also Bajo that extend fishing operations beyond this area into some quite controversial and difficult places, like the Spratly Islands from Palawan, and into the borders, the northern borders of, and crossed into Australian territorial waters. So hugely dispersed. In the Philippines and in Indonesia, they make up less than 1% of the population, but in Sabah, they comprise 14% of the population, and it's a highly fragmented ethnically population. So there's a significant component of the state population, and there have indeed been several Bajo Sama speaking chief ministers, governors of the state of Sabah. So they have political significance in Sabah. The sea nomadic component, though, this widely scattered and really quite numerous population, is very small, and there's evidence that it was probably always quite small, and that they never comprised more than a small minority of the total Sama Bajo speaking population. So there's a lot of them, and they're widely distributed, but those who have a history, a known history of sea nomadism is relatively small. This community that I worked with here, I began in 1964. I was a young graduate student in my young 20s, and and I was doing my PhD dissertation on this community. These were former sea nomads. They had been living in these boats. Some of them at the time. So in 1964, I arrived there. And this is the kind of boat that's called a lepa, that they lived at that time in these boats. These boats are very hard to find now, much like the discussion of the Mokin. But families, some families so that village had about a population of under 600 people, 36 of those houses, but there was also a population of about 15% that still lived in these boats all the time. And they had lived in entirely boat living. This is another feature of the Bajo Sama that appears quite different than the Mokin and other groups we're talking about. They really are boat living, and they have generally speaking, they own no land ashore. So they really are a landless population. And so some of them were still living in boats at the time. And I spent some time with boat living families. Let me let me follow. Let me go to origins, because this was a topic Jacques was much interested in, and to satisfy our friend Jacques Ivanov, let me start with origin myths. Many anthropologists who study the Austronesian-speaking world would say that Austronesian speakers in Southeast Asia have a kind of a preoccupation with stories of origin and dispersal from common places of origin. And rituals often focus on a kind of return to these origin places. The Bajo Laut are very interesting because, and this has been a thing that's perturbed me for some time, because they seem to be largely lacking in these origin stories. This was something that came. Can you hear me? So, yeah. Okay. They seem to be lacking in these stories. What you've got are very highly truncated stories of origin, really stories of how people got from one place to another place, kind of proximate migration stories. So how they moved from this island to that island. And in our second session, Winky's paper described this beautifully, actually. He gave a lovely example of unable to find any origin stories except for one which he recorded, which really told the story of a Bajo community moving from one island to another island because a group of outsiders had settled among them that seemed to be armed militants, and they felt endangered. And that kind of story, being driven off by outsiders, I found repeatedly over and over. Not only that story, but sometimes stories of being taken by shore patrons, and moved from one area to another. Those kinds of stories were reoccurrent. So this thing that characterized these, I think there are two things to my mind that characterize these truncated stories of origins. One is that these tended to tell of people moving because threats or some catastrophe. The other kind of story told of people losing their bearings and finding themselves in places that they didn't know how to return to where they had come from. And one of the most common stories I encountered with the Bajo Sama that I was working with was a story that they were, in the past, they live in these boats. They in small groups, highly mobile groups, and shifting composition of these groups, organized around cores of women. So they were matrifocal kind of organization, with men coming from the outside and joining these groups. They tell the story of one of these groups. At the night, they put their poles to tie up their boats into the sand, using the pole. But instead of going into the sand, the pole actually went into the end of the pole went into the gills of a pahi, of a stingray. And during the night, while they were all asleep, the stingray began to swim and swim and swim. And when they woke up in the morning, they found themselves surrounded by sea that they had never seen before. They didn't know where they were, and so they settled down. They settled down there. These stories of losing their bearings, not knowing where they are, is a common feature again. And this kind of reflects the view that land people have of the Bajo too, that the people who travel without a clear destination. They travel from place to place. They're always seemingly on the move. The shore people are trying to control them, but they constantly wandering off. So there's this view of them as people without control. They're like floats. In fact, this is what they would often described as flotsam and jetsam. They're on the sea, they're moving place to place, but without their own volition. They're sort of out of control. We can't control them ashore, and they seem to be wandering about. Some of these stories actually combine these elements of catastrophe and threat from the outsiders and losing their bearings. This famous story of the Johor migration of Bajo into Sulu, which I never heard the Bajo themselves. It's of course recorded in the literature. I never heard the Bajo themselves tell me this story. I heard it actually by a tour guide giving it in Kota Kinabalu when my wife and I were visiting. This famous Johor story, Bajo are transporting a princess who's going to be married. She gets abducted and carried off. A disaster strikes. They can't go back because they were entrusted, her care was entrusted to them. So they begin to wander, and then a storm hits and they're blown completely off course, and that carries them then to Sulu. So there's both those elements are in that story. Let me begin with maybe some background to this place where I worked. As I said, I arrived in 1964. I spent the years 64 and 5 in this village. I lived in as I say, the first two houses were built. The first house was built, well, going back a bit, in following the kind of local stories of movement of people. I found I think these kind of stories are related to sea nomadism, actually, at least the way in which the Bajo Laut practiced it at the time. When I collected stories, I was told that during the beginning, say going back earlier, but a story, an event that really registered in people's memory was the Japanese occupation. And Bajo Laut, these mobile boat dwelling groups, in the Semporna area during the Japanese occupation left and moved across back into the Philippines. This community I was studying was one of two in Sabah, that part of Semporna district of Sabah. It was part of a larger group of about 6 other, what had by this time in the 60s become basically pilehouse villages, but with a substantial still boat living population. In the Sibutu island group, the last island group, the closest island group to the Philippines, and the Semporna district, they moved back into the Sibutu island group, and then there they dispersed. And then once the war was over, they began to move back into the Semporna district, and they lived in a number of places, outer islands to begin with. The principal place that drew the Bajau out to this area was a complex of reefs. These people are basically reef and near-shore fishermen. So it was these offshore reefs formation. Some of them are huge. One that drew them in particular, the Legaton reefs. Later I'll show you, if I have them, the pictures of fishing and large-scale fish drives. These took place in the Legaton reefs. So they moved here first. Yeah, maybe this. Here we go. This is a fish drive. These you can't see any longer. The people use here, you see tridents used to spearfish. They've had, but basically they were net fishermen. So they were driving fish in from these deep water areas. And Legaton also is close to Sipadan Island, a volcanic island off the shelf, the Borneo Shelf, actually, which has submerged caverns, actually, sort of breeding place of sea turtles. And it's a favorite place these days of scuba divers. That's close by, and that also, this turtle eggs was a major item of trade, so that also drew the Sama Bajau people. But they were basically, maybe, do I have another Maxim, I think, they also harpoon dolphin, as you see there. This is the photo. Can you go back to the other one? The other way, I guess. This one's this photo here. This was the younger brother of the headman of the village. I stayed in the headman's house, and I traveled mostly with him. But I also stayed for a time with his younger brother. And he was still living in the boat, so I stayed with the family in the boats. But here, at the end of this fish drive, they were removing the fish from the nets. This is I think a yellow-finned. I think it's a kind of mackerel. This was the fish they were taking at that time. But in any case, the groups moved first from what I recorded from various older people, moved first to the outer islands. Then in the 50s, as the market was reestablished, the market for fish and the whole trading network for sea cucumbers, salt fish, revived, the people drew closer and closer to Semporna market, the market itself. Can you now, sorry about this, Maxim, can you go back to the market, this Semporna market? There it is. This is taken in the 1970s, so this is taken later, and it's the rebuilt market. But the Bajau, these Bajau who were still living in boats at the time, moored their boats right at the edge of the market itself. So they built their sort of the camp when they weren't away fishing. They all moored their boats together there, very close to the market. This is the market later, and you can see perhaps down here a very different kind of boat than the Leipa. These boats with double outriggers, actually. These boats are coming from, these are also Baja Laut Sea Nomads, but coming from up the Sulu archipelago, above the Sabutu Island group in the Tawi Tawi Baja. And their boats resemble somewhat more, except for the outriggers, I guess, and here are others. This is some better photos, maybe. So these people are incredibly mobile. This is a long way down the archipelago. And here they're marketing their fish and they're staying on for a time. But the Baja themselves, the group that I was working with, actually moored in the 50s here. And there's always a problem in Semporna pirates. And so for security, and the Baja were always suspected, even though these people are quite harmless, were suspected of passing on information at least. So they were forced to move to this lagoon, a bay, north of Semporna, but still very close to the town. And in the first slide showing the village itself, you can see its location in a bay. Yeah, that's part of the bay, actually. Okay, so it's built out over, it was completely out over the water. They then built a long, this is skipping around here a bit. This is what shoreline Baja. So Semporna is the only district in Sabah that has a majority Baja Sama population. But most of that population are people like this, shore living Baja, but who depend on fishing, a lot of transport, but also copra was a main crop. This in the 60s and 70s, copra was a main crop. So you can see this island is planted entirely with coconuts. But this is what the shoreline Baja look like. Linguistically, they're very closely related. I remember Jacques saying that he could, if he took his Mokin to speak with Baja, that they could probably understand each other. I'm very skeptical of that because not all Baja can understand. All Baja speakers can understand each other. In Sabah, there are two rather distinct Baja languages, at least. There are probably several more. In Eastern Indonesia, there's a French linguist, Philippe Garage, who's argued that there are two quite distinct Baja groups of Baja languages. And in the Philippines, there's a lot. There's probably 6. These people spoke the Philippine, all of these people here in southeastern Sabah spoke Philippine variants of Philippine Baja languages, and were all mutually intelligible. Though there's quite a lot of linguistic variation. Much of it is sort of chain-related dialects, and as you move outward in the chain, they become increasingly difficult for mutual understanding. But when they're close neighbors, they generally, it's hard to draw lines between where dialects and languages begin and end. But anyway, these stories then, the Baja are then in the living next to the market. Then because of security reasons, they're moved to just north of Semporna town in this bay, and the slide I showed at the beginning of the village itself there. This is part of this bay, and in the picture of Bajolaut collecting, I don't know, later, can you, Maxime, can you go onward, or can I do that? This again, the bay. Here it is at low tide. This bay is enormous, and here the girls and sometimes widows and older women also collect particularly sea urchins and sea slugs and all kinds of, and seashells. Lots of things here that they collect. So it's also a collecting area, but here's where they'd moored their boats, and as the water goes out, tide goes out, much of it is exposed. The village itself was located close to two tiny coral islands called the Bongo. Pu is the Sama term for island. It's also, interestingly enough, the term also for constellations of stars, and the Baja are keen observers of stars, as you could imagine. And Bungo, Kalabang, Bungo are storks, so these two islands had. But these islands also functioned as burial sites, so that the only real attachment of these local groups, mooring groups, were burial islands. They buried their dead on ashore, and that was really their only attachment, firm attachment to the land. So this is the sort of history of these short movements, and by 1950, about 9 years before I arrived, the first houses were built. I'll try to go back here if I can. Not sure how I do this. Can I go back to the first picture of at the beginning? Yes, this. So the first village was built in the center. The first house was built in the sort of center, and it was built by the government-appointed in Pinglima, the first government-appointed headman to represent all the Sama Dilaut, all these sea nomadic peoples in the Semporna district. So he built the first house. The second house was built by. So his wife and the wife of the man who succeeded him, Pinglima Tearing, who was the man whose family had 13 children in a very small house, and I shared it with them. And living in the boats was even more close quarters. So that was the second house that was built, and then gradually others built their houses. So in the 9 years between the first house and when I moved there, most of the population, as I said, had settled, and the young people were beginning to go. Young boys were beginning to go into town. Semporna town wasn't far to go to school. So this is the kind of stories that one gets, and these help trace the history of the local community and how that's moved within this local area, but they don't tell us much about ideas of ultimate origin and how they actually dispersed over long periods of time. Luckily, we have other kinds of information, and one of the things interesting about the Semporna district is that it's also the location of a major early Austronesian archaeological site, a site called Bukit Tingkorak. And this was only located, this is located at the end of the Semporna Peninsula. It's only about 15 20 kilometers from this village, actually. So it's very close by. It is an early archaeological site within an area of sea nomadic presence. And it's extremely interesting for that reason. It was initially the beginning of the excavation of this site was in the 1980s by Peter Bellwood was the director. And it's a rock shelter. But what's interesting about it is throughout the whole period of occupation, which was from about 3,300 years before present down to about 50 AD, all of this time period, the site was used apparently as a pottery making site. And it's pre-ceramic, trade ceramic, pre-metal site. Now one might wonder why a pottery making site, and why the connection? What kind of connection might that have with sea nomadic peoples? Well, I don't know about Moken and the Orang Suku Laut, but Bajo Laut use pottery in two ways. One is to be able to carry drinking water and store drinking water while on the boats. The second way, now hold this, the second way is for portable stoves, which they carry the boat on the boat. So here, actually, this is one in the village with sort of things to start your fire. They also made pottery. Bajo make pottery jars. But these are these stoves. So to be able to cook, if you live full time, you don't have land ashore, you don't spend part of your life ashore. You live it all on a boat. You need something to cook your food on. So this is what is interesting at this Bukit Tingkarang site. There are thousands of pottery shards. And a lot of these shards are of large jars, and of these cooking stoves. So there's and indeed the pottery. Some of this pottery comes from a village quite close to Bukit Tingkarang, and it's the Japanese archaeologist Rintaro Ono has made a careful study of these pottery, and particularly the pottery stoves, but of the pottery at Bukit Tingkarang, and then he also did a detailed analysis of food remains at Bukit Tingkarang, and discovered that the site was heavily dependent on marine resources. Two things maybe. In addition to these pottery jars and stoves, also at the site were other thing interesting here and important is there was also at the site red slipware pottery, which is diagnostic of the early Austronesian diaspora. So what appears to have taken place is that by the time migrants, Austronesian speakers, had crossed from Taiwan through the Philippines and arrived on the eastern coast of Borneo, they had developed, at least some small part of that population, had developed a highly specialized marine adaptation. So this Bukit Tingkarang, the food samples studied by Ono revealed that this site was heavily dependent on marine resources. The primary subsistence activity were fishing, hunting sea turtles, and collection of mollusks and other sort of sea and maritime invertebrates. So it was heavily already developed an adaptation that was heavily dependent on marine resources. And so quite specialized, and it had some of the material culture that is continues to be shared by sea nomadic peoples, this easternmost sea nomadic groups. Something else interesting, it was also found, this is, as I said, pre-metal, so it's Neolithic, Neolithic site. The stone tools being used were small blades, and sort of multiples of them. They're made, some of them were formed of obsidian. This obsidian, you can locate obsidian quite well, actually, and the source of this obsidian appears to have been the New Britain Islands in Western Melanesia, which are thousands of kilometers away from the east coast of Sabah, suggesting a really developed navigational expertise and long distance navigating. It's also the basic center of principal center of Lupita's cultural development, and hence it's related to the dispersion of from the Philippines of Bajo Samas, these Austronesian speaking peoples into ultimately into Oceania from Western Melanesia. So it's a very important site in the history of the Austronesian diaspora, and its relevance to sea nomadic peoples that concern us here is that it suggests that very early in this dispersal of Austronesian speakers, by the time they arrived on the east coast of Borneo, they had developed, some of them at least had developed specialized maritime adaptation. They had also developed some of the basic material culture that sea nomads in this part of the Austronesian speaking world depend on to this day. There's also, am I going too long?
No, this is fine. I just
Okay.
came in
It's
again.
me who moved from laptop to mobile phone. Okay.
Yes, please go on. Thank you.
Do you want me to say a little more? Or
Yes.
okay,
Yes, please.
Okay. There's also linguistic evidence about the origins of these Samabajo people. It appears that as Austronesian spread through the Philippines, it split. And as I suggested here, some groups moved on into Melanesia, and from there onward into Oceania, others through Palau, into Oceania, a sort of complex movement there. But some groups also established themselves in the island of Borneo. And in Borneo itself, Borneo is sometimes described as a kind of a sort of place of dispersal of Austronesian speaking peoples, and it appears at this point there emerged a kind of split between Eastern Austronesian groups that moved on into Eastern Indonesia and have more connections with the Pacific, and a Western group. So what the linguist Robert Bluss calls tentatively a Western a Western Indonesian branch of Malayo-Polynesian. And this is interesting because all of the sea nomadic groups that we've been talking about here, all are speakers of this Western Indonesian branch of Malayo-Polynesian. Now, we didn't know when I wrote my book in 1997, we didn't know the kind of larger affinities of Bajau Sama. Some people thought it was a Philippine language, but it had distinctive characteristics which didn't quite fit. And it was actually through work of linguists interested in the sort of westward Austronesian expansion of Malagasy to Madagascar off the east coast of Africa, and how those Austronesian speaking peoples got to Madagascar. And the work suggested that Malagasy is actually related to a Borneo language, a Burrito language family. And in connection with this kind of research, again, the linguist Robert Bluss then established fairly convincingly that Bajau Sama actually is a Burrito-related language. He calls it part of the greater Burrito group of languages. So it's actually, and it seems to be closely related. It's not particularly closely related to Malagasy, actually, but it is somewhat more closely related to speakers of the sort of southern branch of this of this greater Burrito subgroup. And most of these people are actually the speakers of Burrito-related languages are Dayak, indigenous Dayak people of Borneo, central, southern, and eastern Kalimantan. So an unlikely people to be related to these maritime people. So these are basically Swidden agriculturalists, the great majority of them. But the Burrito is a very large river, and Bluss suggests that by origins, the Bajau Sama peoples are actually the linguistic ancestors of the Bajau Sama people were actually a riverine rather than a maritime people. And he proposes that in the first millennium AD, there was in the Straits of Macassar, the Strait of Macassar, a Srivijayan Malay trading network. And the Bajau became involved as transporters of cargo and were drawn then, with the development of this economic system, were drawn into the straits and settled then on both this sort of eastern shore of, established themselves on both this eastern shore of Borneo and the coastline then of Sulawesi. Now, Bluss is not a historian, and there are problems. I think this needs a lot more work, but there is some support, linguistic support for it, because, and this is something maybe people like Jeffrey Benjamin and Vivian Wee might speak to. There is a kind of ancient substratum, and I think Jacques reports it with Mokin as well, of Malay loanwords in Bajau. And so there is some evidence of contact with Malay trade quite early, and probably in this time period sometime perhaps early in the first millennium AD. We know that there were trading centers along the east coast of Borneo, and even some evidence of written literacy and monumental sort of buildings. Even it's a strange place to find them, but that's the case. Now there is another linguist that has worked on Bajau Sama, worked before Lust actually, a New Zealander named Kim Pallison, and he worked in this. His interest was the reconstruction of Bajau Sama languages spoken in the sort of Sulu archipelago of the Philippines, of Mindanao and the Sulu archipelago of the Philippines, and he was able, in kind of reconstructing an early lexicon to trace the Sama Bajau back to this same period of the sort of latter part of the first, the sort of early part, about 900 AD, 900 AD, about this first millennium AD. And he proposed that he found when he studied these various languages, Bajau Sama languages, the most diverse concentration of languages, distinct Bajau Sama languages, was actually fairly north in this Sulu archipelago, more towards Mindanao and parts of Mindanao on the east, actually, and Basilan Island, and coastal parts of Mindanao. This was quite unexpected, and this poses a problem because we often think of areas of densest diversity are probably centers where these languages sort of took form and then began to disperse. And areas where there's great linguistic similarity then probably are areas of recent spread. So this runs quite decidedly counter to, it's a long way from Straits of Makassar up here to Mindanao. Although it's not impossible, of course. He actually Pallison even reconstructed the ethnonym for Bajau Sama ethnonym, which is Sama actually, and this probably the original term used by this. It would seem to be the first term, and he traces his Sama back, the use of Sama back common among all these early Bajau Sama speakers back to about 900 AD, which makes it one of the most ancient ethnonyms, I think, in Southeast Asia, if he's right about this. Now, from later historical sources, once we get to 15th century, we began, Magellan's chronicler mentions sea nomads in the southern Philippines. We got European sources actually on sea nomadic peoples in the Sulu archipelago, and it appears that then they become caught up in trading networks. So again, this idea of Bajau becoming differentiated, drawn into a maritime orientation. One of the things Pallison did establish in this reconstructed lexicon that Bajau languages, the kind of lexicon displays a variety of different ecological adaptations. So there's a lot of terminology for navigation, for fishing, boats, but there's also a lot of terminology for ironwork, pottery, farming. So he proposes really that it was a very ecologically heterogeneous group, and though largely maritime in its orientation, not exclusively so. And it seems that as the Bajo become increasingly locked into these trading networks, and these trading networks developed early in the Philippines too, in the Sulu archipelago, this sort of, I don't know if it shows it here, but there's the central island of the archipelago is called Holo. And this becomes an early center of trade with China and with the Middle East very early on, and becomes a major center. And the place in which the Sulu archipelago develops, and this is the center then of Bajo dependence on this trading network that's dominated by Tausug rather than the Sama themselves. But the Sama seem to appear to have pioneered this network of island ports of trade, and but were so widely dispersed that they never concentrated their populations in one place. Whereas the Tausug, the ethnic Tausug on Holo Island and the other large volcanic high islands of the archipelago were agricultural and much more numerous, and they tended then to dominate. And this happens in eastern Indonesia later on as the Bajo are drawn into trading networks of other groups like the Makassarese, and most importantly, the Bugis, and this draws them, pulls them out in the Trepong trade, draws them out into far out into Eastern Asia, right up to Australia, the coast of Australia. And I believe that it's during this period of formation of these pre-colonial states and trading networks that the true sea nomads began to emerge as we first see them in these early European accounts as highly specialized seafaring people recruited to dive for pearl shells, and become specialized in trade in sea turtles and dried and more basic kind of commodity trades, which involve dried fish for rice, a sort of basic agricultural staples for fish and fish products, sea products, even for salt and for interior groups. So it was a complex trading network, and then you really began to get this sort of specialization. And so the Bajo at that point sort of range across the spectrum of shore-oriented peoples like what I showed you in the slide with their coconut and copra trade. Bajo specializing in drawn to this sort of complex of reefs, so specializing in fishing. But so I think they appear in the form we're familiar with them, probably in the sort of 15th century, maybe earlier. Paulison says about the 10th century they began to disperse, so beginnings of this trade. But certainly the Sulu archipelago, the Sulu Sultanate is fairly late and becomes a really predatory kind of political system engaged in slave trading and piracy. Okay, I'll just leave it. I'll leave it at that then. And if you have questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm sure there are plenty of questions. Who would like to start?
Well, could I say thank you to Cliff for pulling together very complex.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, sometimes it cut.
Yeah, can you?
Yeah, but I mean, you were starting. Go on, because my microphone seems to have it. Please.
Yeah, I just wanted to say Cliff has pulled together some very complicated material, and I think emphasized something that also is a problem in the ethnohistory or reading about the ethnohistory of the western end of the islands. Namely, people tend to want to look for single origins of things, but when you're dealing with populations that are connected at sometimes great distances by marine movements back and forth, you're not going to get a very simple answer. The same applies even to the literature on the homeland of the Malay language, which is now thought to be in Northwest Borneo, but it didn't move from there in a single direction. It moved back and forth. And Srivijaya and trade networks and so on were definitely involved in this as well. So it's always going to be very, very complicated and layered. And the number of linguists who can handle this material, that is to say, those who have the patience to do the historical reconstructions, are always a very small minority of linguists anyway. And the rest of us have to rely on the work that they do. I'm glad you brought in Pallison's work, which was already quite impressive some years ago. I have that book on my shelf and it's very useful. So I thank you for that. I have one or two questions, but I'll wait till maybe later.
No, go on.
Oh, okay. A trivial question. I noticed your photographs of the boats. The bows, the part of the bows near at the water's surface seem to have suffered some damage. Is that a design feature, or is it that they keep getting grounded on sandbanks and the wood is wearing away, or what is that due to?
Do we have there? This is the end of the boat.
Yeah, at the front end. Yeah.
No, yeah. Do you have the picture of the boat? You have one boat going.
Yeah, sorry.
You have one boat going. This is it.
It shows nicely there. But there's a,
okay. No. Actually, this is a design.
Okay.
It's a carved ornamental design. And there's a lot of carved ornamental. There's also this bowsprit that they stand a pole. There's a platform, and this also underneath has a. I have some slides actually I was going to say for Jacques, who's interested in boats, of the design. Is there a picture where he's making a boat?
Yes, let me find it here.
This is. Well, no, you can't really see. This is now. But you see, there's also designs on the end, even on the end of the boat.
Yeah.
And a lot of ornamental work. These boats. The irony is there's now a Leipa annual Leipa regatta in Semporna. It's a big attraction, and these poor sea people, and they now make sort of totally inauthentic versions of these boats and sail them. And there's a very inauthentic version of the Leipa in the Sabah State Museum. There's a much better one. There's actually a nice Leipa in the Japanese National Museum in Osaka, except that they cut it in half. So there's sort of a half of it protruding out of but it's quite a good one. But they've now made this a sort of tourist item, even though these people themselves were looked down on. Yeah, no, it is a very distinctive prow. There is one of the things that I hadn't expected, discovered that their boats have an orientation, a sort of left-right orientation, so that there's a kokan, a head side, So you have to sleep with your head to the head side of the boat. So you have to sleep across on the deck of the boat. And it was always a problem for me. It was very uncomfortable actually, and I'd prefer to lie straight, but you can't do that. But this is now the traditional jars have been replaced by these sort of Chinese pickle jars.
These are the same jars that, as I'm sure you know, were traded, of course, inland into the Iban areas. Is that right? Are they the same?
No, these are not heirloom. These are not. No, these are jars they get from Chinese that are used to transport pickled vegetables in. They were getting those at the time. I'm not sure what they're carrying now. Don't really live on boats any longer, so it's not so important. The water in Semporna is from wells, and it's extremely brackish, so it's very salty, and it took some time to get used to drinking it. But Bajo who go to other places complain about the water not having any taste.
From this photograph, I wonder if Vivian and Cynthia have any comment on the fact that this is a rather rare picture of galang type rollers, which we often hear about as being part of the story of supposedly of the Orang Galang subgroup of Orang Laut, because one of the things they used to do was to help roll out the boats, and galang is said to mean roller. So you've got a couple of them there under this particular boat.
That's unusual. I never saw that much.
Jacques,
J'entends pas bien, moi.
question?
Vous m'entendez? You hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you very well.
Okay, I can't hear you very well. I'm sorry, I have something bad connection. Yes, Clifford, thank you very much. You enlightened my end of the night. Because the objective for me was to link Eastern and Western, and to try to find any clue or whatever we can put together in order to understand the spread out of all this Austronesian. Of course, we will not understand and find everything, but this is a start. I won't mention anything about linguistics, because, you know, when I try to bring some Moken with some Orang Laut from let's say Malaysia, and even from Patani, because I find some Bugis and so on, but I was not trained enough to know exactly what dialect they use to exchange between themselves. At that time, I did not was able to differentiate all the Malay dialect. The only thing I noticed is they can interact very easily. Well, so whatever I said at that time, you know, linguistically speaking, is maybe not relevant. What I see is they understand each other in a way that I would not believe was so strong. So maybe it's, as we say, a vernacular language. I don't know if you say that in English, vernacular. But I have some question about the Samal, on the shore living Samal, as you say. Is there any reason that they stay on shore? Did they explain that they stay there and not go on boat, or is there a general story that say that yes, they have to stay on shore and not on boat, or any special reason?
Well, it's generally the people who live on boats have a very low status. I mean, the more seagoing you are, kind of lower the lower your status, the more sedentary you are. The anthropologist Charles Frake expresses really, really nicely in for the Philippines, where you have people who take the name of some local feature. So I guess it's really quite interesting to me. These maritime, I in my book call them the Bajau Laut, but they call themselves the Sama de Laut, which means the Sama of the sea. Yeah, and so that they're sort of, what distinguished them was the sea in general, not a specific locality, but the sea generally. Whereas the people ashore were eager to have some local identification, and all those others. The village you saw there was a Sama Kubang, and they were the earliest group in this important area by their own account. But it was very, and the term Kubang then becomes a term that was generally used for that particular region, actually, among Sama-speaking groups, and a lot of these other Sama groups that arrived there. Well, as I mentioned, I think this important district is the only district in Sabah in which the Sama Baja-speaking peoples are the majority. And in the sort of end of the Sultanate, in the turn of the century, when the Dutch, the Spanish had gunboats and were embargoing the whole Sultanate and destroyed the port at Holo, and went in a systematic campaign to destroy these boat building settlements and people who are these sea-oriented communities. A lot of Sama then began to move from the Philippines and establish themselves in this important district. And some of these people were actually, some of them were quite agricultural and quite settled. So it's an interesting place because you can get a kind of diverse groups of Sama speakers in relation to one another, and they had this sort of system of trade among specialized groups. Some of these people on these low coral islands had really very few resources. Luckily, cassava manioc came in as a staple, and they could feed themselves, but some had no resources, so they became specialized in metalworking, pottery. The pottery groups that produce those stoves are one of these. That in some of the clay they use apparently was also used by the Bukit Tengkorak people. So you get this sort of highly specialized Baju groups engaged in trade with one another. But it was all of these other groups distinguished themselves by particular specific localities. It was important to do that. And I think, again, this may be related to this idea of people wandering the sea without any purpose.
So this means that this relationship between the Sama living on shore and the other one living on board, they have a general idea of what they are doing. It's a kind of a network.
Yes.
Okay, that's what you said. Another question is the burial island, where they put their dead person. Do they the marine people, let's say the one who used to be on the boat, do they stay around this burial island, or do they go far away and leave them, or sometimes they go back to, or do they have any duty on this specific island where they buried them? Is there a specific island where to bury them, or?
Yeah, yes, there are specific places, and they go there only to bury the dead. I had a slide, but I guess we didn't get it of actually burial. But the island in which I guess I sent you a photo. These so in the Sibudu Island group, there are several burial places, and they've been burying there for a long time. Yeah, no, I guess it never got. There's putting. Let's see.
No, I don't think.
Here's something for you though, Jean.
Black one?
This new rice, Bagpai Bahahud, rice. Here we got a sea nomadic people with no land ashore, but they have a rice ritual, a new rice ritual.
Since when?
And this has been well described now. There's a number of Malaysian anthropologists and ethnomusic people working with Bajo, this community here in Bongo Bongo. The sort of dance, a lot of this is accompanied with dance, not this particular ritual, but making mountains. I talk about it a bit in my book, but there are much better accounts now being produced. But it's so.
This rice. This is rice. Huh? This is.
These are rice. This is rice.
Is powder,
they get shamans.
Rice, huh?
Shamans They get it from shore people.
Yeah.
And
so the ceremony you mentioned it's a rice ceremony.
Yeah.
Coming from somewhere else, or
coming from other people, land people. Here they went. There was one of these groups I mentioned that had sort of just before the end of the Sulu, at this sort of period at the end of the Sulu Sultanate. There were these rice-growing communities of Bajo that had settled in Sporna district, and they went to these communities and arranged beforehand so that at the time of harvest they could take back rice. There were even groups who went, I'm told, to work on the rice fields actually. The other thing is that the Bajo Lao, in the stories they told, had all the terminology for Swidden rice cultivation or dry.
It's quite interesting because I cut you, I'm sorry, but there is a kind of a connection of the rice ceremony with Moklen, who used to do some dry field rice on land, and so they make a ceremony, rice ceremony. I have seen a few of them, and what was interesting is when the Moken arrived within the Moklen ceremony, it appears that the shaman of the Moken take the lead of the ceremony, of the rice ceremony. And he knew perfectly what to do. And the Moklen who grow rice and should do the ceremony, and the Moklen who did not grow rice performed the ceremony. And when I try to look further, I find out that the Moklen themselves used to, even in the islands, to grow some little garden behind their house, where they grow some a lot of it could be sorgho. I don't know is the English name, sorgho, millet. Sorgho, c'est quoi?
Sago.
Sorgho, thank you. And millet and the other plants, and of course rice, but in very small amounts. So it's kind of a reminder that they know how to grow these plants. There is galanga as well. that's the trade for spirit and so on. So even in the Moken Island, there is some people who grow a little amount of rice and only for ceremony. And I didn't notice that until I saw the Moklen making the rice ceremony because they grow rice. So what was striking is for me is they go on sea to trade for rice. They are a sea slug or whatever they collect for the trade with their middlemen. And the first thing they ask is rice. You know, they ask rice to the other people, but themselves they can grow rice. So in fact, it looks like they don't want to grow rice in a big amount, and they let that to the literal Moklen. But they themselves will grow a little bit for ceremonial purpose, but for eat only exchange. So what you said about the commerce, international commerce, or even the network of commercial who push sea nomads to be more, let's say, spread out around the island or settle in this place or this place and specialize in that and this. Yes, it has been a good explanation for a long time to say that the Sea Gypsy were Moken at that time, when they say Sea Gypsy, were pushed away in an island in order to collect sea products to exchange. And since, let's say, 1 or 2 centuries, like you mentioned, that means when there is a commercial network who was quite efficient, and then, yes, that could be why they still have this rice ceremony, but they don't grow it, and then they have to exchange the other one. And another thing I wanted to say is there is a lot of things that culturally speaking, you have like the Japanese, like the piracy, like the pressure, let's say the external pressure will push them away. And then it seems that they are never free to, it's not themselves who are going to go at sea, but they are pushed away by slavery. In Myanmar, it will be military settlement and so on and so on. So they always have to deal with pressure. And the nomadism, what we call nomadism, it's always something which has to be linked with the pressure of the other population, whether it's commercial purpose, whether it's wanted to be settled down, and then whatever the reason, nomadism is to be linked to the pressure of the other people. You mentioned that, and that we are working with Maxime on the link between nomadism and how the people like Moken and others can live in with oppression and oppression very strongly, and they adapt in this kind of with their mobility. So mobility is linked to that. So I agree that it can maybe have let's say two times in this nomadism story. One is I cannot go further than you go with a linguistic study, but clearly with the international market and the demand of seashell, of sea slug, of turtle, of whatever the Moken and the Sama could collect, make them go as real sea gypsy. So you see, there is no, in fact, big difference. This is why the link between the Moken and the Moklen looks very different, but in fact is not so different if you go deep. And I have another question. I didn't find it. I have too many, so if you have, yes, it's about the you told us you have the biggest village or the biggest group you have seen. Can you tell me how many boats, for instance, you have seen in one time gathered together? If you have 10, 20, 30, 40, up to how much?
I think that this photo of the fishing drive, this
Yes,
here we are. Here we are.
Yes,
This one.
Yeah, I see.
Oops, this one. Yeah, here.
Yeah.
That's the largest grouping of and you won't see it anymore. This is the largest grouping of boats I ever saw.
So it's almost 15, we'll say?
Oh no, it goes clear in a circle. It's too bad. I should have sent you other photos. I have a series of photos actually. They're driving them in from the.
But if they are all from the same group, or they have to gather from different groups?
No, they're all from different groups. They're from both from the Semporna. There's two communities in Semporna, and then the Sputu Island group. There's quite a number, and a lot of these were the largest settlement in this whole area at the time in the 60s. Was at Satonkai in that Sputu Island group. And that was a community of about 3,000 people actually then.
Quite a lot, no?
Yeah, and this has happened to the Bajo Laut that I worked with. Now are a substantial population, and it's very heterogeneous. And they've kind of people I work with have now really settled, given up fishing. Some are still involved in fishing trade.
So if they don't fish now, what are they doing instead of fishing?
Oh, they're doing a lot of the stevedores, a lot of on the port, the docks. Then you find stevedores, Bajalat stevedores up on Sindakan and up and down the coast. But they also do what happened in the time that starting in the 60s and going into the 70s, after independence, the border became increasingly tense. And now this eastern border from Semporna, Kudat, is really essentially militarized. It's patrolled. There's great concern, not only piracy, but also of people coming to the southern Philippines and wanting to claiming sovereignty over here. So we've got the border. The borders become very problematic. I mean, these people lived on both sides and they moved back and forth quite easily. But now it's extremely difficult. Those I worked with have really given up fishing. But some of them are still in the market trade, and some became very prosperous because when they closed the border, Bajalat coming from the Philippines then came as for a time they were accepted as refugees, but refugees had very limited rights, and they came with few resources, and the Baja then became patrons and supplied them with fuel for outboard engines and later inboard engines, or even towed them out to fishing areas and then marketed their catch. So they controlled their catch. They became and they took over the role of some of the shore people, actually. It was a very
so they can adapt quite well.
They adapted all too well. They became rather exploited.
Actually, I had a question about when they were still living on board, which I believe was prior to the 60s, right?
Yeah.
As you said, most people see them as always wandering to somewhere else without a defined goal or something else. But as Cynthia made the point already, and it is the same for the Moken, finally mobility is quite well organized between, based on access to resources, kinship ties, etc. So for your communities, when they were still living on board, which kind of mobility, or what we call generally nomadism?
Yeah, well, it's absolutely right. I mean, it was a kind of network that they moved within. So they, and these people actually had a history of even a network extending beyond the Sabutu Island group, further up the Sulu archipelago, down the coast into Kalimantan. And before the Second World War, that was a very extensive network. But it was the network, and people circulated within that network, and they were drawn. So, and it was very fluid because conditions would improve in one place, and people would flock there. So, it was a kind of people in motion rather than being fixed to one place. But it was that movement was, I think Cynthia is quite right. I mean, it is a kind of is moving within a network, but for purposes, and there were reasons.
I have a stupid question, but just to figure out, because for the Moken, the mobility, there is the mousson, Maxime. They cannot
monsoon.
go at sea during, when it's really, really raining. So it means that the mobility of the Moken is really stopped when the monsoon is very strong. But since that the main reason why they stay in land, do you have any like this? They can stand those boats. They can go in a high sea with the bad weather, or do they have to stay in land when you have a?
Yeah, that's a very good question. In reading your material, I was struck by the significance of this sort of the seasonal. The importance is there is the shift in wind, but it's not, and there's periodic sort of dry. It's drier. This part of the coast is definite monsoon, but it's not. On the East Coast, it really isn't a handicap. It doesn't all movement at sea doesn't stop. But people relocate these moorage sites to seek shelter from the winds, and then there is a sort of seasonal movement. There was in the past a kind of seasonal movement. That bay in which they're living, which is now really part of Semporna has this enormous kampong air now that extends into that, and what was the village is been sort of absorbed, and these people have become, so the Bajo now are associated in Semporna and in Sitankay with a very heterogeneous sort of community, maritime, all kinds of maritime groups, Bugis and Bhutanese and all kinds of people now living there. So what began as a Sama Bajo sea moorage, basically. Nobody coming there and visiting it now would have any idea that had once been
I think Vivian has a question.
Yeah, I have a bigger question and a smaller comment. Clifford, have you heard the term Ilanon? Because this is the term that is found in the Malay language texts like the Tufat al-Nafis and so on. Yeah. Now, the Ilanon are known to be pirates, and in fact, the word Lanon has come to mean pirates in Malay. In Malay, Lanon means pirates. So, and I don't. There is no other term for the pirates coming from the area that you have just described. In fact, on the north coast of Sabah and basically the Philippines archipelago.
Yeah, there is an Iranian community. They prefer Iranian. They call
Iran.
themselves.
Yeah.
Today, they're very sensitive about that use of the term as pirate. So they're trying to avoid that connotation. But they in fact, they were heavily involved in the slave raiding. And on the East Coast, it is partly because of the Ilanon settlements that the chartered company was extended their control over particularly the Murdu, and then down to Kudat, from Kudat down to this Semporna area. But they're different. They're a different group related to people in Mindanao. So linguistically, they're different, but they sort of had connections on the East Coast too of Sabah, but also on the north.
So is there no relationship between the Bajau Laut and the Iranian?
Linguistically, they're different. The Iranians, the homeland of the Iranians in Mindanao, in the sort of lake area. So they speak quite a different language, a real Philippine.
Yeah, but I found that actually the Orang Laut are linguistically very talented and they can speak many languages. And even the Urak Lawi that we met in Phuket, they could speak Melayu, quite easily. So I don't know whether they were just monolinguals or they could speak more than one language.
That's hard with Bajau too. I mean, that how they do speak multiple languages, and I sort of picked up the sea nomadic variety of Sama, and it was always they thought it was very hilarious because when I spoke Sama, it was the sort of the lowest of the low. It was like speaking Cockney or something. I mean, it was very funny. But yes, they speak multiple. They're the same thing, and probably there were some when I was in 64 and 5. There were actually some Tidong speaking peoples who actually speak quite a different language. But these people also were just multilingual. I mean, they spoke quite very fluent and different varieties, sort of different. The main lingua franca, Sama lingua franca, was the Sama Kubun, but they could speak all kinds of variants. And a lot of in Bongo now, I mean, you meet all kinds of people, but Iranian, they were there, and they did establish these ports early on in the sort of late 19th century. As sort of slaving centers of and also to control the bird's nest trade in the eastern coast, and then there are also Tausok there, so Suluk as they call them oftentimes in Sabah. So there were a number of non-Malay Muslim groups. The Bajau regarded themselves as Muslim. There are some slides there, but we won't go into that. Of a kind of what would we call it? Of this very mixed sort of Islam. Syncretistic might be the best.
Yeah.
So this sort of Mandi Sapal. I don't know if Maxime, you ever found those slides. This is sort of it's the Bulan So it's an Islamic thing, and it's conducted by both shamans. Oh, let's see.
So this one? No.
Yes. Okay, this is shaman. It's bathing with children. So it's in the month of Safar. So it's Islamic, but it's so both the imam in the village and the shamans in the village conducted together, and it's a very mixed sort of thing. I don't know if this is still practiced in Malay world.
Yeah.
Was
The tribal people in Bintan, suku Bintan, they do the mandi sapa. So this is is a very big thing. But my smaller comment has to do with the rice. So tepung tawa, which is a rice ceremony, a rice ritual, is still practiced by Malays even in Singapore. So in Rio Linga Islands, definitely, so you don't have to grow rice. We don't grow rice in Singapore, but we still have this tepung.
So they live in flats.
It is found all over Southeast Asia, and it is said to be of Hindu origin.
Well, this would make sense.
All right.
Can I ask?
May I have some questions? Oh, sorry. Chao, please go ahead.
I was just wondering if we could go back to, that question where you said that when they were still nomadic, it wasn't like they were just, sailing anywhere and everywhere, but it was a kind of a network of places that they would go to according to, what's kin related. So now that they are no longer nomadic, do they still keep to these networks, or have they been, restructured or reorganized? And then the second question is, you showed a slide there on the pottery industry, and you showed how, those containers, those vessels were made, to have water in the boats and things like that. So now that they're no longer nomadic, what's happened to that pottery industry?
The pottery industry. Well, it's still, here, it's still there, but it's dying for sure. But some people, I mean, with kerosene stoves and things now, they don't. There are some people who still like to use them, and so you still see them in the village, and they're still marketed in the market. At least there was. This was, I don't recall exactly when this. I saw them. I think the last time I was in Semporna was about, I think it was, but it was a very brief visit. It was in 2000 when I retired. I think it was about 2004. I still saw them. I went to the market, of course, and but very few. So, and this is cassava, pungi kayu in Sama, like ubi kayu, but pungi. So they still do it. They still make it, but it's a dying thing. I forgot the rest of the question, but the networks. The networks.
The first question.
The networks is very. I find it very interesting because when they settled, when they started building houses, what they did, they created these. They created a kind of sedentary version of networking, so that they build houses in groups. And at the time I did field work, we call those groups, what do we call them? Bana, which is a term for a school of fish. And this is the way they had moored their boats together. They use these sort of mooring poles, which they insert into the seafloor. And then they tie boats more to them. They tie up to them, but they tie up to them often in groups. So the networks are almost really like network. And there's a lot of terminology in describing networks in terms of, and mending networks, using literally the nets is a sort of metaphor, not just so. But when they build the houses over time, then they create these clusters of houses. They called them, at the time I worked there, they called them Banaan, which was a term for school of fish. But they have since used the new word muluk, which means a kind of cove, which was often placed, so it's a sort of sheltered place where you can moor your boats to keep out of prevailing winds. So I don't know the meaning, but what's his name? Kasufumi Nagatsu has worked in the village since I did, and he's found that the terminology for those groups has changed since my time. So they're now referred to as sort of this sheltered area where people cluster together. But unfortunately, Bango Bango has burned down twice and been but most of it had burned down twice and has been rebuilt, and it was built then, laid out sort of rows, everybody was issued. So it was a government project to build housing for the Bajau Laut. So they were all put in the same kinds of houses and assigned places, and the whole pattern broke up. So you can't see it. It was destroyed, which is a great pity. So people are all over the place now. So the network is still there, and the network extends beyond then Bongo Bongo and certainly goes into the Philippines. And it's important now because of the restrictions on movement. So if you really want to facilitate movement, you still have to have it's more difficult, but you still need a network of contacts. And when I was in Bongo Bongo initially, I traveled across that border with Bajau Laut, and it was really important. You'd see European tourists try to do it, and some of them ended up caught by the Philippine police, which is about as bad as you can get, or actually ransomed. So it was a risky border. But if you had Bajau, contact networks, I mean, I appreciated having my network as well. So it's not really a system of relationship. It's a system of relationships rather than, sort of communities based on a sort of sense of place. And that's why I did my original research with the Bajau Laut, was the question initially I posed of, how do people arrange themselves that live in boats and are mobile? So we don't have the usual coordinates which people use to form social communities, which are sort of land place based, and the networks was the thing that worked, and it worked even to the level of sort of the metaphors people used to talk about their kin relationships and remending and a constant process of extending and maintaining the connections and preventing them from rupturing, so that they kind of holes in the net. So you spent much of your time sort of weaving it back together. But I don't know why they've changed their terminology for the group. Perhaps it's less fish. I mean, the fish don't make so much sense anymore, maybe.
Could I make a language comment? These claims that people can understand each other, when in fact we know on other grounds the languages involved are very distantly related to each other. I think this is probably because their ears pick up the the substantial number of Malay loanwords that occur in all these languages, and they probably fasten on those Malay loanwords and kind of reconstruct in their minds what on earth people are talking about. I think that's rather significant that all these languages have Malay loanwords in them. Percentage in Tagalog is very high as well, for example. But this leads to a mythology that people understand each other when in fact they don't. It's quite commonly believed that Malays and Tagalogs speakers could understand each other. Well, they can't really. On a visit to Vietnam many years ago, on a visit to a Cham village, the tourist guide encouraged me to speak to the village headman because she had heard, she being an ethnic Vietnamese, because she'd heard that Chams and Malays could understand each other. Of course they can't, although in fact the two languages are quite closely related, but good 2,000 years of separation between them. So these myths are, these ideas are quite widespread, but I suspect it's a function of Malay loanwords where, if in cases where they actually do understand each other, I'm assuming, of course, where they haven't actually learned the other language, because sometimes they do.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's this, one of the assistants in the Sarawak Museum, you might know of him, Jeffrey, Teuton Cowboy. Teuton spoke a language that's virtually a Rajong sort of Milano-related language that's virtually dead, Tanjong or something it was called. It's almost disappeared. There's only a few speakers, but there was enough relationship that he did the same thing. He could speak all sorts of languages, but he had some sort of basic elements of languages that are related to each other, and he had the gift to be able to, pick up those kinds of clues you're talking about. And there may be a lot of that going on in this part of the world. I don't know. But Malay is interesting, and it's certainly it's changed the way in which Sama Bajo and Semporna classify themselves now, because of Malay medium Bahasa medium schools, and there's no longer this really dominant lingua franca. That role is taken over now by Bahasa. And so they now talk about themselves as, and the Bajos become more use of Bajo rather than Sama. And then talking about Sama Laut and Sama Darat. And there are Sama ways of talking about this distinction that are falling out of use and being replaced even by Bajo themselves, by Sama speakers themselves.
Sabah Malay is, of course, rather more similar to Bahasa Indonesia than Peninsular Malay is, and that's probably
really?
It probably helps them communicate over bigger distances as a result.
Really, that's interesting. I didn't know that.
I don't mean the true ethnic Malays, the Orang Brunei and the west of Sabah. I mean this more general variety called Sabah Malay. Which
there's a
second language for most people there.
Yeah.
I think Ajahn Supang raised her hand.
Okay.
Thank you, Ajahn Puk. I would like to congratulate to our friend Clifford for your very interesting and comprehensive presentation. I'm interested in the point of the metric focal practice among those Sama. How that is practiced, and are there intermarriage between the Sama and the Bajau, and whether when a person die, they will be buried at that time or they will be put in the boat. Those rites of passage that I'm interested. Thank you.
Intermarriage, let me start with that. There are lots of intermarriage, actually, even in 60 when I was first there, but some of it was probably would be familiar to other people working with CP people, that there were shore groups that would take Bajo these Bajo Laut women as wives, and establish then a kind of link. And these would be people who are trading in fish, and so you had those connections. But now, as the people have settled, as I said, this what was a village has turned into a para-urban. It's just been virtually swallowed up in Semporna town, and now the Bajo intermarry very extensively. It's become a really Nagatsu really has described it very quite appropriate as a kind of Creole settlement of generally maritime people. It still identify itself as Saba, but are actually very heterogeneous. The other question of burial and death rites, they really conform to sort of Islamic practice, at least in the 1960s, certainly when I was there, except that in the slide I had, it shows a burial in which a lot of grave goods are put into the burial. That's not very Islamic. The graves, very little, the very grave sites are incredibly compact, so that when you dig a grave, you almost invariably turn up bones from other burials that have been there before. And I have lots of slides or lots of photographs of burial sites and burial rituals. But they make grave markers. They mark the graves at the head, and they're carved grave markers that are very distinctive, very beautiful. Some of them are extraordinarily beautiful. Some made of coral, mostly of wood, but they're just packed together. So they're just bodies are just in there densely. So it's and it's difficult to make graves oftentimes on these corally, and it's raised coral rock, and so they're not very deep, and I don't know what else to say about them. But the burial is within 24 hours, done very quickly. And there is a kind of ritual involved. They're buried on shore, and Jacques was mentioning this. I think that they're separate from where people live. They're separate from the morgue site, so you have to transport the body by boat, and this is still largely the case. So the bodies are physically removed from, and are taken to the grave are taken to the grave sites by boat, and there is a ritual about of removing the bodies from boats and carrying them ashore, and then mourners taking leave of the dead before they're buried, and then oftentimes buried with grave goods. The picture I had was of a famous old woman who had a collection of the Kulantongan, of these graded gongs, and she was a great musician, and nobody really could take her place. So they knew she wanted them in the other world. So they sent them off with her. But the rest of the funerary rituals were really, shrouding the dead, while bathing the body, and wrapping it in these pandanus mats, They make beautiful, the Baja make beautiful pandanus mats, much like those I saw in the pictures of your westernmost sea nomads.
Yeah. Actually, we found that this burial ceremonial of carrying the body to another island, which is very often at the opposite side of what they call their mother island, had a purpose much like of the Styx River, of the
Yeah.
bridge of crossing to the other world as well. And that now, because many of these sites are inaccessible because of whether it's a resort or a pearl farm or whatever had been implemented on these islands, they have to reorganize all this ritual system.
May I ask related question about perception of inland and forest? Was there any differences between the shore Sama Laut and the sea one, those who live in the sea?
Yeah, I kind of really had to answer because I didn't have that much contact with the shore people. But certainly for the Baja Laut had a blanket prohibition against consuming. That's why I'm so surprised at the Moken of consuming animals that live ashore. They did had the photograph of a harpooning a dolphin. They did harpoon dolphins. I think I'm told that they don't do that. They're haram, and they don't eat them anymore. But they did. But that was the only thing they wouldn't eat. Even just sort of chickens and beef and deer. There were lots of deer actually that came into that lagoon. The Semporna Peninsula originally was called the Tongkolong. So it was a point like Tong, a sort of cognate in Malay with Tanjung, and was a forest, a jungle, and the inland parts of Semporna district were, even in the 1960s, were not really occupied by people. And this goes back to an earlier time in which this was the inland areas were a zone of transit by people, Chionic kind of speaking peoples who were guarding and attacking, actually, this sort of disrupting in various ways the bird's nest trade, attacking inland people, riverine people further up the east coast of Sabah. So it was a dangerous place to go into, actually, and everybody sort of avoided going inland, much so that until the sort of logging boom and then plantations, people didn't go much into the interior. The Baja, the groups I worked with certainly tend to avoid mangrove swamps and worked this sort of shore, clear sandy beaches and reefs. So they like clear water. They didn't like to go in there. We got this sort of kachang roofs for their boats. They got also from trade, people living this sort of land people ashore. I got dinghy fever during the course of field work, and had to be helicoptered out to spectacular event. It was during confrontation. Luckily, there were military helicopters at Tawau that flew me out. And when it was my own fault, according to them, and possibly right. I went to film, take photographs of, and to participate in making offerings to a site at the edge of the village, at the shoreline edge of the village. And most of these places where people anchor, there are sort of tutelary local spirits associated with these places ashore. And this one, so that they were associated with sort of resident spirits. So I just taken photographs, and I'd come back, and I was struck with the Grasser thought I had spinal meningitis. I couldn't walk. I kind of collapsed, and the shaman that I was much connected with said, you know, it's clearly you've disturbed this place. And so when I came back, I had all the sort of rituals performed, and then a part of his payment that he wanted was a new kajang roof for his lepa. And so we had to go to one of these shore villages, and we had to wade through mangrove swamps up to your waist, black, couldn't see a thing where you're putting your foot. You couldn't wear sort of flip-flops because they get sucked right off. So you had to go barefoot, and there were I was keenly aware, because I had around this bay, there were lots of vipers, these nasty pit vipers, and those lurking in those mangrove roots, and I shredded every bit of it. But we went in and we bought I got this kachang roof for him. But there is a lot of, the other interesting thing is when you get sick, one of the things in sort of diagnosis is to track where you've been, and then to kind of work out a diagnosis on the basis. So if you did go ashore, it was really a place of illness, and it generally was, because these people later on, they began to work on plantations, and they all got malaria. It was just universal. Everybody got it, including sort of cerebral kinds. It was really, really nasty. So it was a sort of dangerous place. So there was some reluctance to go ashore and to tread around to there. But the shore people themselves didn't venture at that time, didn't venture far from the coastline either, and stayed mostly on offshore islands. So most of the population at the time I first went there, in '65, you could only get to Semporna by boat. There was no roads yet. They were under construction, but they hadn't been completed. And those aerial photos I was able to take, there was also building a landing strip in Semporna, and they'd sent a plane up to sort of test it out. And so they said, hey, well, how about, I wanted to get a ride on it so I could take pictures of the village from the sea and from the air, and from other villages around. And there also see people fishing from the air. They constructed these sort of net encirclements, and those nets could be tied together. Part of this metaphor of nets, they could tie their nets together and sort of make these complex structures of surrounds. So you could vary the composition of the sort of labor force working on fishing. And this also was a factor in these groups forming and dissolving, dependent on the nature of the fishing. And sometimes you had to have the cooperation of those put their nets together. I'd like to get, I wanted to get some pictures of that, various kinds of fishing operations you could see from the air. But anyway, I don't know if that helps.
Yes, thank you. I think we should have another book that also make us reflect fieldwork experiences. Thank you.
Yeah, well, that was a nasty one. I was just told recently that you can get dengue fever again, and it gets worse each time. It gets worse. It's not like COVID apparently. Once you got it, and then finally you get the hemorrhagic variety, and you die.
Cliff, do you remember when we had both passed through Singapore from our initial fieldworks? We both together, that's when I first met you, went with Ivan Polunin to
Yes.
Orang
Oh,
Leta settlement on the west coast of Johor. That was definitely in mangrove, although, of course, they
yes.
were in boats at that time.
Well,
They'd acted in mangrove. So what was your impression,
yeah.
having just come from Sabah and then visiting this very different kind of Orang Laut settlement?
Yeah, well, it was totally different. I remember that vividly. I have photographs of us there.
Oh, you have
Yeah.
photographs. Oh, we might be able to use those if we've been looking for
Oh,
photographs.
yeah,
I
yeah.
said that period, yeah.
I've got several rather good ones actually. Yeah, but I wrote to Jacques about that. That was my only contact with, and you recorded the language, if you remember.
Yes, yeah, but unfortunately it turned out to be 99% cognate with Malay. Some students from the department I'm teaching from now, the linguistics department at NTU, have been working on the language more recently. It is a Malay dialect, but it's less than 99% cognate with standard Malay. So I think that was a figment of my just talking to them in standard Malay. I think that's all.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. No, I remember that vividly, but yeah, they seem to be totally different. That, I mean, they were there cutting mangrove for a charcoal factory, wasn't it? And no, the Bajo avoid those kinds of places. But I was also one of the things Ivan said was, and of course Ivan had been to the place I did my field work. It did this Bongo. He had been there, and that man doing the work on the boat building, he was a good friend of Ivan actually, and Ivan had mentioned him. It was a contact, one of the important contacts for me actually. But Ivan had recorded Bajo music from that place and others, and he was struck by Bajo Laut are incredibly musical people. I mean, they play kaba, this bamboo xylophones, but the music, the singing and music, dance traditions are just fabulous. He said those Johor Orang Laut didn't have any musical instruments, and he thought it was a kind of cultural loss somewhere along the line, and that he was struck by how different that was. And when I was doing field work before electricity at night, everybody was playing and singing and in the village in the sort of moonlight with all this music. It was just spectacular. It's really a vivid part of my memory of doing field work was the music. I can't imagine do you know, is that true? I mean, had some of these Orang Suku Laut lost music?
The three of us who've been down in Riau found exactly the same with the other Orang Laut there too. They had instruments in the past, including gongs, violins, but they've lost them for a range of reasons. We have in fact written this up to some extent, but you're right. Yes, it is strange to spend the night in such households without music. I have Ivan's disc actually as a published LP of his recordings from Sabah. I don't know whether you know of that. I could digitize
I do
it.
know it. I do know it. It's absolutely magnificent. Yeah. And I recorded music, but I didn't have any kind of decent recording, and played it for him, and he was disgusted. I thought it was magnificent, but he said, "Oh, it's not like it was," and
Yeah, yeah.
he'd been there.
So yes, there has been a loss of instrumental music, and of course, the occasions to dance to the accompaniment of that music as
Yeah.
well. So there's a variety of reasons for this.
Yeah.
Amongst in the Johor and Riau people, that's partly well, very largely because previously they used to perform for Malays. They would who would be hired as musicians, but the overall social relations have changed, so there's seems to be little call for that anymore. And Cynthia can probably confirm this. I think they just sold their instruments and ditched them and don't do the performances anymore.
But the Orang Laut in Pulau Tujuh, you know, which are further away from the political centralization, they still have theatre like Mendu, and they so they may actually still have musical traditions that have not been captured by the Malay state.
Yeah.
There's quite a revival of Bajo dance, and it's sort of as cultural performance now, not as some kind of touristic. Some of it's quite spectacular, actually. And this is being studied. And another thing that the Bajo shamans or spirit mediums did was this igal, that dance trance. And I wanted to go back. I actually had grant money to go back and study that, but I couldn't get in because of Tun Mustafa and politics. But it's well studied now. There's a great ethnomusicologist at University of Malaya. Is done really excellent work on it. So and even when I was there in the 70s and visited the village, they were organizing themselves into professional dance troupes. They were so they had come to identify that as a sort of a culturally, as part of their cultural heritage themselves, actually, and were cultivating and teaching it. And it is, I guess I don't have I had a marriage picture though, but I don't have the pictures of dance. It's also part of the wedding ceremony of dancing. But the shamans also danced, and they had and they then spoke in spirit language and evoked spirits and sung long sort of narratives as well. So it's quite evolved, quite a developed tradition. But it was all with music and dance. So it was sort of very theatrical.
Yeah, I've seen this in Kota Kinabalu where they Dajjal wedding ceremonies with lots of music and dance, exactly as you described, for, of course, people visiting from Singapore.
Yeah.
So were they performing for themselves, or were they performing for, you know, visitors or tourists?
They performed. They performed both. So in the village, I think now there's this area. There's a lot of professional troupes that do it. They also have professional singers who sing, and there's a kind of music industry. There's a recorded music industry actually of Saba music. So there's a lot of, you can get cassettes. I've got quite a collection of them, but they're played with sort of amplification, all kinds of. There's also the Bajo, the Philippine Bajo have a different musical scale too, because influenced by the Spanish. So, and things like guitars too. So they've also what would we say? They've assimilated musical traditions that they've encountered. So it really is kind of central cultural focus of Bajo, but they do it for weddings, and they bring in now professional musicians to sing at weddings. But that was done by local local people in the past, of course, who just did it as they had the special skill to do it. And they're great xylophone players. I love the gabon that they play. It's magnificent. And sing to it. And there's a lot of singing. And there's also music tradition that accompanied sailing. So there's a lot of songs sailing. They're sailing songs. So they sung at sea. And all of these songs are there's a lot of, it reflects this movement thing too. There's songs about landmarks, that we're approaching a landmark, and that recalls memories of that place, or we're going back to our homes after a long absence, and we're going to see these people. Then some of them are quite, and there's a lot of things about. There's sort of epics too. There is a sung epic about Sea Spielman, which Harry Nemo has recorded one version of it. It's a story about, it sort of spooked me out a bit, because it's a story of sailing with a white man, Sea Spielman, who has a shotgun and he's able to shoot things, and they sort of covered it. And in the end, they murder him for his shotgun. And apparently Harry says it's actually it's based on something that happened in the Philippines in the sort of early in the 20th century. But traveling with them as a companion on board a boat, listening to them sing this. Luckily, I didn't have a shotgun with me, and I wasn't much use. But anyway, that's so they sing sort of narrative songs too. And then there's this great tradition of this must be gone now. Nicole Rebel's done some recording of this in the Philippines. This calling of sort of spirit beings that are kind of heroes between gods and human beings. These are quite spectacular, who invoke spirits who come to listen, and these are performed in connection with healing sometimes. Anyway, there's a lot there that, unfortunately, as a graduate student, I was sent to study social structure, that we all were in those days. And I didn't pursue these other things. Are we still connected?
Okay. Yeah. I was thinking maybe we should consider wrapping up also, because I'm not sure how much time we still have left on the Facebook Live transmission broadcasting. And then if you still have some energy left, we could have a very, very short closed discussion about
some energy, yes.
All right, so just in order to close this this public session, let me thank you all very much, to you, Cliff, and to everybody, especially also our French speakers and, and who are in the middle of the night.
Morning
now.
It's 6 o'clock.
Okay. So thank you very much again, and I think we can now close the live streaming.
Okay, good.
Okay, thank you very much.